This is the beginning of a lecture on political and cultural socialization. Uh, you have to start fundamentally with human nature. So, if we don't start there, everything that's built upon it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And before we can talk about human nature, we need to kind of see the movement forward of human beings. Because if you're talking about culture and political socialization, you're talking about the creation of a society. The very idea of culture is that there's some measure of consistency among people, and that somehow that commonality binds them. And the rationale for that is that there's a sense, as we've evolved, that in a world that's uncertain, if you think about it, when we become more thinking, rational beings, we begin to understand that we live in an environment where, unlike all the other inhabitants of the planet, we're keenly aware of the fact that we're not immortal, that there's a point at which we end. So when you think about it, we're here, don't know how we got here, we're moving through this vastness of space we don't understand, and that we're going to die. So the uncertainty of the human experience is unique because we think about it. We're aware of it. We know that any meaning there might be, we have to sort of figure out over time and get a better sense of how we manage to function through this vast uncertainty. And that the things that we need, the fundamentals, are the things we look to first. You can't philosophize if you're hungry. Once the basic needs are met, now you can kind of progress sort of into higher levels of thought. No one's a philosopher who's starving to death. I guess it's an absolute. We don't like absolutes, but it's hard to imagine that someone that's starving to death anywhere on the planet, any human being, somehow has managed to not worry about that. So we look for, it's very consistent with our movement forward, we are looking for some measure of certainty about those things at a bare minimum that are important to us, survival. So then it becomes really important to figure out where that concern about survival begins and ends. How far are we taking that? What's our concern? What's considered survival? Now, as we'll talk about, that moves forward. As we become more and more aware and more capable of controlling our environment, two things happen. We put our environment at risk because we need, right? Human beings go beyond just what most other things on the planet do to survive. It's not just about our needs. Once we get to higher levels of consciousness, it's about our wants. And that's where the conflict begins. Pretty soon, those wants melt into needs. And once you perceive something as a need, you begin to seek it out at the expense of others who may also need that same thing. So what we have here is we have a need to distinguish between the two, and therein lies the problem. What is it we need? What is it we want? And once our needs are met, why shouldn't we want more? Why shouldn't we want to be more comfortable, less at risk? And these things are the wellspring of the idea of first just culture, and then political structures, because the purpose of a political structure is to really take the culture and the shared experience of those people in that culture, which we'll get to in greater depth, and somehow manage to forge institutions that are consistent with those things and perpetuating them. So we live here with limited resources, with unlimited wants, and once our needs are met, we move beyond that. If you think about the elites, how much money, and I don't mean, this is not a criticism of capitalism, but it's a rational view of things. How much money, how many resources do people need? And the elites especially. And we'll get into power as a fundamental tool for managing this. So if you look at sort of the evolution of human beings moving forward, there are many critical stages. The first few I'll just run through. We're really more concerned with modern society, but it's helpful to understand sort of the movement forward in our own evolution. So if you go back 13.5 billion years ago, don't worry about this, we're going to move through this pretty quickly. Matter and energy appear. Stuff happens, right? And that's the beginning of physics, atoms, molecules. It's the beginning of the first movement forward. There's the formation of the planet, which we know very little about. 4.5 billion years ago, 3.8 billion years ago, organisms, the beginning of biology. Again, we know very little about that with any real certainty. There are certain things that are certain, but not enough. What we get is really 2.5 million years ago, we get the evolution of, the genus Homo, right, in Africa. First stone tools appear. You see, the first tools create the movement from a need-based sort of endeavor to a want-based, because those tools help you be more efficient, and that means the greater likelihood of surviving and moving forward, and that means the movement more towards wants than needs. And then we get humans spreading about 2 million years ago from Africa to Eurasia. And then we have the development of different human species. Now, this is important because what you'll see is that we have managed, Homo sapiens, of which we're members, we're a little smarter. And that allowed us to pretty much take out the other species of humans, if you will. Around 70,000 years ago, so the cognitive revolution, and here's where things really begin. Here we have the emergence of language. There's the beginning of culture. As soon as there's a common language and people can communicate, the ideas can become more complicated. The vocabulary of today, is much more granular than it was back then. Also, there's the beginning of history. History is important. Once there's language and you have a history that you can recall and you can learn from, then you have the beginning of, communication on a much deeper level. And so over time, what we get is human beings sort of settling in what is now Australia. You have to keep one thing in mind geographically. This landmass is all connected. And then as this continental drift, it breaks apart. And that's also important because now you have an isolation of certain groups of people. And within that, you've got a microcosm in terms of the number of people. And they have to sort of create their own cultures. And people will differentiate based on commonality. I mean, think about a college campus. Queens College has a pretty mixed group of people, right? All kinds of ethnicities and the like. We tend to gravitate towards those things which are familiar, whether it's food, whether it's language, whether it's a shared experience in some other part of the country, race. People seek the familiar. There's comfort in that. I fit in here without making tremendous effort to, fit in. Over time, if you think about it, and America is a great example of this, people first come here, that first generation that, comes here, they tend to look for areas in the country where there's a lot of them. Same country, same part of the world, same food, where it's comfortable. The next generation, the children they give birth to that are here, they want them to keep the old ways because they know that this works, that this is comfortable. And those children usually do. They marry into their same group and they share that same experience. But that second generation now, it's harder to keep them wedded to the previous culture because not only have they been born here, like that first generation here, but their experience has been so inculcated by things like education one of the tools, right, that are important for socialization, because they foster a sense of unity, they begin to move away from that primary culture, if you will. And certainly by the time their children arrive, so that, there's a fair breakaway. You see people marrying, different ethnicities and so on and so forth. That's been the American experience, and it's been the experience elsewhere, because the commonality here is no longer the old country, if you will. The commonality is here. There's an American culture that's been built, and that, third generation begins to attach itself to that. And we move away from family being the main source of sort of social interaction to peers and that sort of thing. Okay, 30,000 years ago, these smart Homo sapiens, us, we managed to really get rid of and extinct the Neanderthals. They're brawnier, they're stronger, but they don't have the intellectual capacity that we do. So fundamentally, at that point, we get sapiens, coming across 16,000 years ago, and coming into America, what we consider, what's America today. So now we have the beginning of, if you think about geography, that's the beginning of the creation of various cultures, because the most important shared experience is the environment you're in, what you need to survive. So again, as we move along and we become more sophisticated and we have higher levels of thinking, there's a transformation from those needs to the wants, and then after that, there's a blurring of that line between those needs and those wants. 13,000 years ago, we have Homo sapiens as the only surviving human species. We've taken everybody out. Now let's just stop and think about that. Higher levels of capacity of thinking, and what's our first? I can't say first, but what's the movement? We get rid of all those that compete for the resources we want, and we can do it because we share something. We share a higher level of intelligence. That's the key thing. We understand more, and we can use the environment to eradicate our rivals because of need. And the perception of resources is local. In other words, we don't think about where other resources might be. We move on to find them, but it takes a while for us to understand that those resources are things we can control. We don't have to go foraging. So think about the American experience. Early on, the main source of raw material for providing shelter and the like was wood. And we come to the point where we're growing crops, so we need to clear fields. So all of these trees come down, and they're used to build homes. They're used to, provide warmth and all of that. When that begins to be problematic in terms of the availability of it on some level, there's a movement west, looking for more resources. And that's sort of been the movement forward until we get to the agricultural revolution around 12,000 years ago. This is important. We realize that we don't have to go looking for food. We can create it. Now, how does that aid culture? You're in one place with other people for long periods of time. And so you learn to work in that environment. Human beings either learn to get along or the likelihood of them perishing goes way up. Okay, so the agricultural revolution is critical. You need to be in one place long enough with other groups to create a common bond, which is culture. Once the culture is there, then you have to think in terms of, well, how do we keep this thing going? How do we manage the problems that we're coming into with this culture? And the answer there is relatively simple. The answer is you need some sort of political structure. You need some way of controlling the behavior of others. And we'll get to it, but now you'll see that this is the rule of law, eventually. And you'll see when we talk about the United States Constitution that all the things I've talked about here are embedded in that document. All of those things are really about being able to function politically. So the foundational focus of political institutions is always sustain the culture and advance everybody's well-being. Once those structures don't work in that way, then they really have no purpose. We do it to create a system where we can all survive. So the agricultural revolution is really, really key. I know you've probably heard that said 1,000 times, but think about it. No more foraging, no more looking for animals to consume. We learn that we can actually have animals reproduce, keep them on the farm, and when we need food, they're there, along with crops we've grown. This is key. If it were not for the agricultural revolution, we would not have to stay in the same place. In fact, survival might demand that we keep moving. So now we're locked down, right? And regardless of what you think about food sources and all of that, that's something that comes along, whether you should be a vegetarian or what have you. That comes along much later, when really we find out that our need to survive based on food can be met by growing crops, and science comes along, the scientific revolution, and pretty soon we're now manipulating our environment. And when we manipulate our environment, that's the beginning. That's the beginning of a competition for resources of a different kind. All right. So the first thing that's important is Homo sapiens getting rid of all the other competition. The next thing is, and there's movement, which is fine, Australia and all of that. But basically, we get, with the agricultural revolution, these permanent settlements, right? And then you get empires around, 4,250 years ago that start developing. Then something really happens 2,500 years ago, which is critical. We need to be able to exchange things. Now we're in one place. I have a lot of animals, but I really want different animals to serve my purposes. So in the beginning, I can trade with someone. You've got a lot of pigs, and I want, and I've got a lot of cows. How about I give you a cow, you give me a pig? Or with crops, right? You've got a lot of X, could be corn, could be wheat, and I have a lot of the other. Let's trade. So that begins, and so that's the next big thing, because now what we're doing is we're learning not only to rely on ourselves, but to rely on the importance of exchange. Now the thing here is this: does that mean it comes along with culture? That there's an exchange in culture? And the answer to that is mostly no. Once you stay in one place, you begin to need to be to communicate with, fit into that given culture. If you come forward, think of immigration. One of the things that we expect is that there's assimilation, right, of some kind, and that's a great debate today. Cultural appropriation and all of this. You'll see that that this sort of thing has been sort of a bedrock. If you want to call it appropriation, that gives it a political perspective. I don't want to do that just yet. I want you to think in terms of this being something that is key to survival, the assimilation process. Now we start 2,000 years ago, starting to really get major empires. This is where the culture and the control, the political institutions are very simple. And there are those today, right? Very simple. A few people try and rule the whole thing. But we get, a development of this, these empires. Also, we begin to see, as we try to understand now with higher levels of intelligence, our place in all of this, we get the rise of, and this takes place in at different times, but fundamentally, we get the rise of religion. Once you get higher levels of thinking, you start looking at the stars, and you start understanding something, the scientific revolution, and you begin to look for real meaning. Now, needs are met, wants are intensifying, but now you need to find the philosophy or the faith to believe in something greater. That's what we come to. And so we begin to search, for that. And we get the major religions developing. And then around 500 years ago, and this is critical, outside of the agricultural revolution, which has the sort of influence we've just talked about, the scientific revolution, now we begin to realize we don't know stuff. And it's important to know things that we don't know and understand. Now, Do we seek all those things that are important? We don't really know how important something is. The intellectual capacities have increased. We begin to look at what exactly causes things to function the way they do. Now think about that in terms of the development of religion. You've got religion, which is faith-based, and now you have a scientific revolution that looks for some better and deeper understanding of the mechanisms of life. And that means the beginning of manipulation of those mechanisms, and things get really complicated. And that all feeds back into, especially with faith and science, feeds back into the cultural underpinnings, and gets things to be really complicated. So we start off looking for a way to survive, and we end up here. And it's gotten way more complex, way more complex. And then the Industrial Revolution. Now we have moved off the farms, and we begin to understand that industry, the building of things, the opportunity to do that in terms of currency is increased. And so people begin to move from the country off the farms into the cities. Again, looking for resources. You move into the city, there are mixed cultures. Now there's a city culture. If you think about New York City, there's enclaves where you see these, waves of immigrants, and you see certain cultures set up, and then they kind of get second, third generational interest. They move, other people come in. But the common language, the common boundaries of, this neighborhood in New York, one of the things New Yorkers are very proud of is their cultural heritage, and that New York is developed, it's sophisticated, it's got high levels of all the intellectual pursuits. I mean, you can't have opera, right, without people wanting to go see it, right? If you think about things like modern music, you can't have that without amplification. That's changed everything. If you can't amplify the human voice, you have to have those human voices that are powerful enough to be able to project so people can hear them. If you're going to sing, but you can't project, no matter what the quality of your voice, you're not going to go anywhere. But amplification comes along, and all of a sudden, those that may not have the force to reach now can use all kinds of technology to help them do that, along with instruments becoming more complicated, and all kinds of sounds being able to be created. It gets much more complicated. So the Industrial Revolution really changes everything. So you get agricultural first, which is critical. Then the Scientific Revolution, which changes everything. And then the Industrial Revolution, which moves people about. Now think about the culture. You are on the farm, you come to the city. Can you imagine how different that is? Can you imagine how much that influences what people do in their life? All right. We get to the presidents, and we get human beings, and what they do is they get really sophisticated, and now we get into trouble. Nuclear weaponry, all these things, and we start to blur the line, not only between wants and needs, but just how much we have to protect ourselves from others. Don't forget, we sapiens, right? We Homo sapiens, we're an aggressive lot. It's in our DNA, and we'd have to speak to people that specialize in that area, but it's certainly the case, right? That as we move forward, it seems like we're more interested in blurring those lines between wants and needs, which is where we started. And now the future of us really depends upon culture, our political institutions, and our connection to one another. Now, human beings do share a lot of their needs and their wants, but that doesn't necessarily mean we acquire them the same way. It doesn't mean they're equally distributed. It doesn't mean that somehow we've created a perfect society where all Homo sapiens, where all human beings are treated equally. And that becomes a major concern and problem, because remember what we were doing. We came together to protect ourselves. In some measure, we still do that, right? That's what political institutions do. They set up a structure to do that. So we take these Homo sapiens who seem aggressive by nature, we put them in a situation where they're smart enough to figure out, agriculture, science, right? And they begin to compete for those wants. I mean, if you look at the United States, I'm not sure what these numbers are today, but if you look at the United States, we have enough weaponry um, for the next that is comparable to or equal to the next 17 nations. You take the next 17 nations, throw all the weaponry together, and basically we have as much. Most of those nations are friendly, but yet we keep building up the military, industrial complex is really keeps going, right? From coinage to the sort of exchange we have today, and everyone seeks more resources, which has been a common, element in our movement forward. Okay, so here's what's interesting. We're now past needs. Not everybody. There are lots of people that don't have everything they need in a lot of countries, but the capacity of some has now moved past just needs. So now it's a competition to fill our wants. Think about your own life. You have something. Someone has something better. Say phones. You want that something better. They throw a few more bells and whistles on it, and all of a sudden, you have the world basically in your hand on a phone where you can look at not only what other people are doing, but you can search up all kinds of information. The information revolution just caused this tremendous movement towards, fulfilling our wants. So nobody just wants anymore what they need. They want what they want. Do we really need all these different types of breads? In New York City, they have it, right? What about all these different types of fruits? People think in New York City they have all these different fruits, but the truth is island nations that grow fruits have a greater variety than New York does, New York City does. But that has a lot to do with not only culture, but has a lot to do with exchange. All right, so now what we have is we have a breaking apart of Homo sapiens into various groups. And those groups begin to influence the culture and the political institutions in a way that will benefit them. Sometimes, oftentimes, at the expense of other groups, right? When we can distinguish groups based on ethnicity or race or gender, it seems we have a propensity to do that. Now, I can't say with any real certainty why that might exist other than competition for resources of some kind. Human beings, Homo sapiens, we differentiate on bases that make no sense. I mean, there's nothing that makes sense out of these ways in which we separate ourselves. Nevertheless, it happens. So we look now at this creation of political structures, and we begin to realize that these political structures start benefiting one group over another. So let's talk about, how we break that down today. Remember, we're in a modern society, which means that basically we're looking for the next thing. The information revolution, changed everything. The information is what's important now. But you can't have that be important without exchange. Exchange means people are selling products and the like, and they want to know who's going to buy those. And that's really critical because that garners greater wealth. Okay, so we look at the local societies and the metropolitan societies, and we see this exchange, we see that how that works. But now let's talk about the breaking down of various groups. Now, there's overlap. It's not like we talk about one group, that's the only group that they belong to, and they are differentiated from every other group. You'll see in a second what I mean by that. So let's just look at celebrities. Now, again, you can't have celebrities to the extent we have them today without the technology, right? You don't have massive number of musical artists without the technology. You just don't, right? You not only could you not project and get people to come and hear you, but you can't create media that allows people that could never get to see you or don't want to come see you to listen to your music, right? You don't have to even buy it in terms of having a physical thing. You can download it or whatever. So the technology has made all of that possible. You get a lot of people that would not be able to be in that field, the music field, if it weren't for the technology. And that wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the scientific revolution. And that wouldn't be possible unless there was the agricultural revolution, and so on and so forth. Celebrities are interesting. I've never been able to figure out what the lure is. Why we are so drawn to celebrities. People like to be near them. People go, and sit in on studio audiences to be closer to them. I think that they don't understand it, on some level. I think it becomes very difficult to sort of sustain yourself when everyone is thinks very highly of you and places a great deal of importance on you, but you're still stuck in the world of wants and needs and trying to figure out your place. And sometimes that's a very difficult place to be, where others have placed a value on you that you may not be able to get your mind around. So it's not uncommon for people of, celebrity, to challenge and be concerned about what their place is. Now, I don't want to be oversimplified, but certainly we often think about people that have everything and say, why did they do this? Why were they so self-destructive and the like? But that seems to be the nature of it. So I've never been able to figure out what it is about celebrities, at all. Maybe it's the adulation they get from everyone that makes us want to be closer to them. But it's the case because if people didn't want that, there wouldn't be all these shows on television or on the internet, where people interview them and the like. There'd be no interest. And when you think of movies, actors. They're portraying someone else. It's make-believe. It's pretend. Now, we can talk about, the need to escape reality and the suspension of disbelief and all that. But why would that be any more than just entertainment? Why would we give them power? Celebrities get behind political candidates. And the reality there is, that doesn't have as much of a positive effect as everyone thinks. But nevertheless, they have a voice. They can get that out through the technology, right? Again, the audience gets wider. So celebrities are an interesting beast. Don't know why. Not been able to figure it out. I don't know of any one that's come up with any ideas that would seem to explain why celebrities have power. And power in its fundamental sort of structure is the ability to get people to do things they would not otherwise do. If you want to, eat an apple, and you're going to do it anyway, and I say, eat that apple, well, I have no power over you. You've automatically decided you want to do it on your own. But if you hate apples, and I say, eat that apple, and you eat the apple, that's a measure of power. That's the structure of political institutions and the rule of law, without which we couldn't survive, but we'll get to all that. All right, then we get to, the idea of the very rich. In a sense, we should put that last because they acquire more resources than I think you can reasonably make an argument they need. That's the want class. In some measure, it's competition, the Homo sapien thing, where you've got 5 billion, I need 6 billion. There are people out there that need a nickel or a dime or a quarter in other countries to save the lives of their children, get them the vaccine they need, and so on. And so you get a mother or father, or both, looking at their infant child, and it takes a quarter or 50 cents to get them the vaccine that will save their lives, but that child's going to die. So, this is mind sort of altering how you get from that much accumulation of wealth to people's children, offspring dying, because there's not 50 cents. It's mind-boggling, heartbreaking, and incomprehensible on so many levels. So you get the very rich. The very rich have acquired all this wealth, as I've said. That's a group that has a lot of power. We've set up a political system in America that requires money in order to get your word out, in order to get elected. And then since you need that money, you're beholden to those that gave you the money. We're going to get to the information age again and how those that control information really have a great deal of power because people can't make decisions based on anything other than the information they get. And if the information is incomplete or somehow it's been distorted, then so is the actions or the reactions of people. So the very rich, and then we get to these executives that may not be the uber rich, but they control companies and the like, and that means production, what people get. If you capture an industry, in making cookies, people can get other cookies. So they come like information to eat your cookies, which garners greater wealth. And for all you know, their cookies are not great, but they're the experience that you have. And so that's what you do. Of course, once you get all of this, you also get those that are have filtered into the military establishment, which you need to protect yourself from other cultures and other political institutions outside of your culture. And then you get, of course, you get the political class that seek power by grabbing hold of the mechanisms of government, the execution of the rule of law, the interpretation of that, the development of it, what laws they decide to put in place. And pretty soon that becomes its own little enclave. Think Democrats, Republicans. Sometimes they just disagree about something because they need to differentiate themselves based on their audience. I'm not going to get into who has better ideas because that's very, very complicated because it's idea by idea, it's issue by issue. Is it a long-term issue? Is it a short-term issue? And how do they resolve that? As soon as you get that political group and you get that corporate group and you get the wealthy, the very rich, and the military ascendancy here, then you have to, and the question becomes now, finally, what's the balance? Where do we need to be in order to affect the society that we all joined either through birth or through will? Going way back, that was the first question. How do you structure a society? And that means you need the culture, you need to socialize people to it, and you have the political institutions. So cultural and political socialization is the main challenge. Because if you don't have a culture that people have been socialized into, and we'll talk about those specifics, but if they've not been socialized into it, that means they haven't fully accepted it. And if they haven't accepted the culture, it's harder to keep the culture together. Because the whole idea of culture is that it's a shared experience that we get from family and we get from educational institutions and the like. We begin to agree on how the world looks. And with that, we become, I think, measurably insensitive to other people's path to the present, microaggressions and all of that. So balance becomes the major problem, and all these groups that I've just mentioned begin to form the power elite, people that control the mechanisms of government, the exchange of goods and services and information, and they begin to change the culture and the society in a way that benefits them. Pretty soon, you get an explosion of population, which creates its own problems in terms of, being able to manage. And so a lot of what the political class does is, divide and conquer. Corporate elites do the same. And so what you get over time is you now have this explosion of population, which means the challenges, the problems that are going to arise get greater. And that means in order for the political socialization to take place, you have to put certain things in place that people accept politically, political structures and that sort of thing. And then we just get to this sense of, immorality. What's moral, what's not moral, which is difficult. Everyone can say, look, this is moral, this is not, right? And ethics, how people act in a way that's consistent with that morality. So let's back up And let's think in terms of commonality. Is there everything, I'm sorry, is there, are there those things which everyone wants and needs? So what we want to do is get back to needs. Are there fundamental needs for all human beings that must be met? Now, before we jump to that, what happens is people think they know what those needs are. You know, look, some people say, I need to have this type of food. I need to have people that make that food for me. I don't want to make it myself. I don't want to go out somewhere to have it. I'm hiring chefs. I don't want to clean my house. I'm going to hire people that will clean my house. I don't want to drive myself. I'm going to hire people that will drive me. On and on and on and on it goes. And those people in the upper classes, they tend to want to group together. It's a cultural thing, right? And that means there's an exclusion of others. But you can't have the masses sort of march on you. So you have to somehow get them to believe this is okay, that some would have so much. And in America, we do that by saying the playing field is level. Anyone in America can make it. Well, obviously that can't be true. If everyone can make it, it means that those that don't have in the moment what's necessary to move forward won't move forward. But we believe that. We believe in capitalism because that serves that idea. And we'll get to that. Democracy and capitalism, they're strange bedfellows in some ways. But I would argue it's sort of the best we've been able to come up with in terms of ferreting out the wants and the needs, because you don't want to have those people marching on you if you've got the political structure in place that serves you. It's why corporations go to a great extent to convince the public that they mirror the latest movement, whatever that is, because they want to move with, not against, mass movements. All right, so let's talk about needs. We're back to that. There's one way to do this. Rawls calls it, I call it a brain in a jar. And we'll get to Rawls and how he sort of defines it. But what this is, if I took your brain and I put it in a jar, we all had our brains in a jar. And we had no physicality other than that. And we did not know who we were, what we looked like, where we lived, what illnesses we might have. In other words, we know nothing about ourselves. Rawls calls it the veil of ignorance. We don't know who we are. We don't know where we're going to end up. We know nothing about us. But once we create a structure, all these brains get together and say, okay, once we get our bodies and we know where we are demographically, geographically, we know what era we're going to be in, well then, in we go. And whatever we create now as brains in a jar or behind this veil of ignorance, we're going to have to live with. So the question becomes, what would we agree on? What kind of a society, a culture would we develop, supported by what political institutions, to take into account the uncertainties that we're going to face in our culture and our political structures? And it turns out, if you think about this for yourself, okay, if your brain was in a jar, if you can get away from those things which define you right now, what would you want? You'd want equality. And then all the things that go along with it. You would want an opportunity, regardless of what reality you face, of meeting your needs at a bare minimum. And without going too deeply into what all those needs would be, what we come to is that the best system for this would be the benevolent dictator, that, all wise, omniscient, that does that. That doesn't exist. So the next best thing we've been able to come up with is democracy. Now, why is that? Because we all have a say. We don't have a dictator. We don't have a structure that necessarily doesn't meet the brain to jar needs, right? Now, we don't have an economic system, which is a big, important part of this, and we'll get to capitalism in a moment. But we develop that system, in we go, and then we have to live with it. And we find out that we're, a certain gender, a certain race, come from a certain part of the world, have certain physical ailments or capacities of some kind. And then we have to live with those. But thankfully, we've created a world where everyone's equal and all the institutions and the culture support that. And so we're all okay. We get our needs, and let's leave wants out for now, but we get our needs met. As we know, that doesn't happen. Not to any real, in an absolute sense. It happens in some measure. Okay, so when we talk about this veil of ignorance, and we talk about these brains in a jar, and figuring this out, now the problem becomes great. We agree on it. How do we create these structures, and how do we protect them so they continue? There's a continuation of them, so we all get what we need. Now, look, it's really important. In America, we love to say that you have control over your destiny. So I'm going to offer up this approach, this way of thinking about it. Think about how little you have in terms of really being able to control in your own life. Okay, so you're born to parents that you had no, we're keeping faith out of this and any kind of other, belief system. You're born to parents that you didn't choose. And that's a major influence on your life, right? Wealth and all that. You can't choose your gender. You can't choose your ethnicity, right? You don't get to choose race. You don't get to choose the era in which you're born. You don't get to choose geographic placement, where in the world you're going to live. The era in which you live is important. Think about Barack Obama, first black president. Would that have been possible 150 years ago? If the same person, right, was born 150 years ago, the likelihood of them being president is almost zero, because anything can happen, but almost zero, right? The environment you're born into, in terms of availability of foodstuff. Then the political structure you're born into, right? Who's controlling the levers of power? The cultural, system you're born into. So think about that. All of those things. And in America, we say, you're the master of your own destiny. It's just that for some, it's a very long walk. For others, they're born and they're already there, right? The most dangerous part of this, opportunity is that if you're born on one side of that river of reality that you have to face, infested with all kinds of things that want to eat you, you have to jump over that and may not make it. The best we can do is stand outside the gates of fate, hope that they budge a little bit and we can squeeze through, and then things change. And in America, we point to those that make it over that treacherous body of water and those that make it through that gate and say, see, anyone can do it. It's not plausible for anyone to be able to do it, because if that's the case, then everybody would do it. You also don't have control over your physicality in terms of your intellectual capacity. We like to believe that education can change all of that. Well, it can add to it. It can certainly help, but it doesn't take away the brain structure, which we know nothing about. Even brain surgery is not brain surgery. I think any neurosurgeon would agree with that. We don't really know how the brain works. We know very little about it. If there's some sort of problem with the brain, we notice that some other medicine we gave somebody for some other disease or illness tends to take care of that problem too, right? I mean, look at right now, in 2020 with COVID-19, there are a couple of drugs, and people don't agree about this. Politically, it's all over the place, but a couple of drugs that existed a long time ago that seem to have a positive effect, I don't want to get into the politics of that, because that's not important right now. What is important is they seem to have some effect. But this was not what they were designed for. One was designed for, inflammation, bringing down inflammation. And it turns out that this disease inflames a lot of the organs, right? Okay. So when we think in terms of our control over things, I think you can see that it's not what we think it is. Yet when you make it over that river, when you make it through the gates of fate, you begin to believe you have to. Now, this is where the crisis begins emotionally and intellectually. do I deserve this? Of course you think you do. But in the back of your mind somewhere, as you see people living under different conditions, you think to yourself, maybe I don't. And there begins the conflict. It's really interesting. And what does that too is the culture. Does the culture support that? We tend to believe in America and elsewhere, the more resources you have, the more deserving you are because you have a special set of skills, right? And that most of us are not really born with a special set of skills, whatever that is and however you define it. Your physicality, again, right, is not up to you. Your ability to sing is not up to you. You can make those things better, but you can't necessarily just walk out, immediately and say, I've got this ability. Some people are tone deaf, couldn't carry a note on their back. Others come out with beautiful voices. And it turns out they're living in an era where that really matters, where that's really valuable. The brain structure is really fascinating. When you hear artists that have had long careers in the music industry, and you ask them about their creative process, they don't know. They don't know. I can't think of a single artist that says, well, I just work at it and I figure it out. They come up with musical ideas, and if you ask them where it comes from, they really can't tell you. And then the gift goes away, and they can't make music anymore. Not because of physical frailty, but for some reason it turns off in their brain. Whatever it is that causes that to happen seems to happen less. That's why long careers in the music industry are really anomalies. Thus the terminology one-hit wonders, right? So why is that? We don't understand the brain. Think about that. The thing that has developed and has made us different than everything else on the planet, right, comes down to our brains. But we don't know how they work. And they're made of fat. It's made of fat. Thinking fat. Fat that thinks. How is that possible? Right? It's meat. It's meat. There's I don't know where I heard this, but I found it very interesting. There's aliens that come here, to check out our species. And then they go back to their home planet, and they're asked, so what is it with these humans? They're thinking and so on. And with a sense of disbelief, those that came here on this mission say, they're made of meat. What do you mean they're made of meat? They're made of meat, but they think. Their brains are fat. Wait, we've got thinking meat on our hands here? You got thinking meat. No, it's a little disturbing for some. But that's the point, isn't it? We don't really know much about our brains at all. We don't know how it functions. We kind of know where certain things might take place, but all of these brain diseases, diseases of the nervous system, we haven't figured out yet. The brain is the last frontier because the thinking is what separates us from everything else, right? We do more advanced things, making music again. I hate to keep harping on that, but I think most people obviously have experienced it. Very few people dislike music. There are those that do. But when you think about all those things that we can do with our brains, and we don't know where a lot of this stuff resides, and we don't know about a lot of diseases, there's a sense that we really don't know as much as we think. But by comparison to everything else on the planet, we do. We know a lot more. I mean, we go into outer space. We build machines that can go up into space and sustain themselves there. I mean, when you think about the things we do, they're unbelievable. But that may be because we're so limited that something that really should be very simple, maybe to some other species out there, whatever, we think are great. And for them, it might be, this is child's play. You think this is a big deal, and it's not. And that's a whole nother, discussion. If there were other beings that were out there, what would that cultural, I can guarantee there's a culture, and I can guarantee there's a structure, because you can't live. Every organism on the planet has a structure for reproduction, for survival, and it's varied and it's weird. what some of the species do in order to reproduce and survive. But the major difference is we know their intellectual capacities are limited compared to our own. So we think, and therein lies the problem, because we have to figure out now what we need to think based on what to sort of sustain us, our needs. And it turns out that in the aggregate, it's our culture and our political structures, and we, born into them, have to learn to embrace them in some way, without, to the detriment of other cultures. We have something to learn from those. Today, the whole idea of cultural appropriation is very interesting, because in our culture, that's sort of the way we've gotten to understand each other, right? The important thing here is that, think about it, politically in America, it used to be that politicians would eat your food and, hold your babies. And that was affirming someone. Wow, this is really good. I've never had this type of food, right? Now, is that cultural appropriation, or is that, cultural socialization, right? Where basically in America, there's all these different types of foods and we can enjoy them, or all different types of clothing and we can enjoy those, even though they're not part of the culture that we were brought into. Is it not affirming to that group to know that we like their food? When that culture comes here, we like that food. And we like this sense of fashion, for lack of a better word. Is that good or bad? Is cultural appropriation a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's cultural, right? And the argument is over which culture, right? And whether or not those that are not from that culture have a right to it on some level. Right's kind of a strong word, but should be able to embrace it. Isn't that the idea of the melting pot? Is that the idea of America's unique, not because any one American culture is unique, but it's such a mixture. I mean, it's very, very difficult to define an American. You could not look at someone and say that person is an American. You could hear them speak and not be able to say that person's an American. So you go around the world, different places, and you see people. And you really don't know until you speak to them if they're from the same culture as you. I'll give you an example. I, a few years back, went to another country, not important where, nothing wrong with the country, but I don't want to distract people based on that. And I was out to dinner. And there were other people sitting at the next table, a bunch of young college students. And they heard us speak, and we heard them speak, and we looked at each other and said, "Are you American?" And they said, "Yeah, you are too, right?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, where are you from? Right? What's your culture? Okay?" And I said, with a measure of pride, because that's what we do, New York City. And of course, I expected them to bow down in wonderment and say, "Wow." I said, "Where are you from?" And they said, with a measure of condescension in their voice to us, "Seattle." Why? Because the political structure and the economic structure there is more on the cutting edge. And so it was interesting. They took pride in where they came from, even though it was the same country. So we have many subcultures here. Nevertheless, there is an overarching culture that we've been socialized to, and the political structure that enforces and sustains that. That's what's key. Without that socialization, we are not one. So this leads to the question, is it important to be one? What about globalization? Is that good or bad? It's interesting. That's a really complicated question because you have to break that down to its component parts. You can't just say, well, globalization is better, without being able to say why. And you can't say that in a broad sense, Is it better for the average worker in a country? Some prosper, some don't. Is it better for the elites? Can they gather more resources for themselves? What does it do to the rule of law? What does it do to the sense of belonging somewhere? Which is still important, right? We still want to belong. There's a measure of sanity, a measure of safety, a measure of comfortability with that. Speaking the same language is always something that brings people together. How we do that in America is what we're really interested in. Now, not because, America is someplace incredibly special and we don't need to look at anything else. I don't think, American exceptionalism is a good way to sort of approach all this, because fundamentally, this idea of exceptional automatically, in the developed sort of Homo sapien, means that somehow we are better than you, usually based on economics or political structure. And that is where we find ourselves today. When you think about, in 2020, or really into the future, these conflicts are going to be ongoing. In America, because of the structure of things, now I'm going to say something, very radical for America, and it's really not radical at all. What if it weren't really about those things which separate us gender-wise, race-wise? Like, what if that didn't get so much play? It wasn't a major focus. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be. What I'm saying is, what if we looked at the idea of class and said maybe Americans are more divided by class than they are by these other demographics? And if that's the case, why are these other demographics so important if they're not really driving the equation? In other words, a poor American, however you want to measure that, poverty. Does it matter about your gender if you're that poor? Does race matter? Okay, you're looking for the same, resources, but if we are positioned against one another based on class, and we're attacking each other based on ethnicity and the like, what does that mean about the political socialization? Are we being taught that that's really the issue? And if we are constantly at one another because of those differences, which has an impact on the political structures and on the cultural structure. What if it turns out it's about class more than anything else? More than anything else. If someone is worth $10 billion and they are of one gender, and I don't want to get into discussion about gender because that's another entire class or two, course or two, because it's a very complicated, as is race. These things are very complicated, and here we have to focus narrowly on culture and political structure and their mechanism of socialization, because we have to. We can't cover everything. We can't give everything its due, so we focus in these courses on little pieces of it, and the idea is if you take enough of them, that you get a better understanding. Not a complete one, because we don't have that, but a better understanding. And it's complicated. It's fascinating, and it's complicated. So I have to give somewhat short shrift to these things, because otherwise the lectures and this course would just start bleeding into all these other courses, which are very specialized and very complicated, have many multi-levels to them, which no one person knows all of them, or can provide enough insight and information to really have it matter. So there are other professors that this is their area of specialization, and those are the courses you need to take to really look at them, in greater depth. I can't do that. So even something, when we talk about gender, it's a very complicated topic. It's not something that can be done in 10 minutes. That's something that would take 45, 90 hours, 2 courses just to begin to get your mind around. So I can't do that. So you'll have to understand that I have to sort of make these big leaps, jumping over fields that are incredibly important and ideas that are so important to structural, sort of entities. But that can't be. I can't do it. All right. So what I hope you get from this is a few things. What informs the culture and what informs the political institutions, what the job, relative basic job is of each of those two things, its level of complications, this idea of wants and needs, and these various revolutions which have moved down the road and have changed the culture because our experiences inform them. I mean, we're going to talk about capitalism, and what you'll see is that it's a great idea with many failings. We keep coming up with imperfect systems, and that's because we're imperfect, and we don't know how the times are going to change. There are major complications out there that we can't foresee, and so we put together, to the best of our ability, what seems to work. So a fundamental idea here behind capitalism, right, is private ownership, that you should benefit from your own labor. You'll see when we talk about the Constitution that, because that really is what our culture and political structure is based on now, right? Or is supposed to be based on. You'll see that capitalism, in some ways, really runs contrary to the idea of democracy, mostly under the idea of capturing wealth. You can't have a free democratic society if you have the haves and the have-nots. If you have relatively few people garnering all the resources. Because that was the fight from day one, right? Looking for resources, whether we're foraging, whatever we were doing, resources, having our needs met. And then all these revolutions and our evolution has led to the blurring of that line to wants. And why shouldn't we want things more than just those things which cover our needs? Well, that's the game. How does that structure itself? What does that do to all of us? So let's look at the economics of this, right? Of the culture. You can't ignore it. Economics and politics are opposite sides of the same coin. You can talk about political anything and ignore the fact that there's economics, staring us in the face. So, what are some of the basic, fundamentals here? This is not a course in economics, and again, it'd be several courses going into greater detail than I can go into here. But fundamentally, to give us a sense of this, the idea, right? And I'm not going to talk about microeconomics, how business functions, all of that. Macro is what we're interested in. Macro is really tough. Micro is nice because you get sort of, here's, this business function, here's how it works. Macro, it's kind of very broad, but nevertheless, it's informative. The idea is that if you allow people to seek to their own benefit greater prosperity, they're going to want to do a couple of things. They're going to want to acquire money, and that means doing something, and they're going to want to protect that money, right? So let's just look at acquiring it. The fundamental idea is you have an idea, you create something, and people buy it. They want it, right? That's such an incredibly vast understatement, but we'll suffer with it. And so the idea is that if I come up with an idea and I make something and a lot of people like it, someone else says, Bonomo came up with an idea and this guy's making a lot of money. I think I can make a lot of money too. So they go in and they start making it. Now I realize one morning I wake up and I think, wait a minute, these people are competing with me now. Now I've got two ways to go. I can knock them out of the market somehow so they can't produce it, or I can compete. So let's talk about competition. So, all right, so this guy, they steal some of my business. So someone else comes in and says, there's still a lot of money here. They do it. Now we're competing. The fourth comes in, the fifth comes in, the sixth comes in. And this is the way it's been. Think of telecommunications. This is the way it works. And pretty soon, each of us has to come up with a better mousetrap, right? Whatever it is that I'm producing has to have some advantage over the others. And one of the things is I got to get my price down, which means I have to get the cost of the raw materials down that I use to make the thing, whatever that might be. That's why information is so great. You don't need a whole lot of stuff. That's why brick and mortar is going away. Buildings, they're an expense that you don't need. Amazon has made that very clear. All right, so we start to compete, and we want to make a better product for less money. So the fundamental idea is, as we all start competing, we come up with the better mousetrap. We improve our product in any number of ways. We can't get into that, but and we lower our price. The other folks, they compete and they lower their price and try and come up with a better, right? And eventually, the consumer really benefits because as they compete with more people in the marketplace, better and better products, lower and lower cost. That's the way it's supposed to work. Now, if you're seeking your own wants and you want to capture the market, what you do is you go out and you try and keep others from coming into the market. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. You can grab so much of the market and control it, which is what Microsoft did, which is what Amazon has done. And the drill is the same. Keep other people out of the market, control the market, raise your price, and give an inferior product to increase that profit. If no one else is competing with me, they can't get into the marketplace, I can give a more expensive product of lower quality, so I garner more profit. I mean, that's a great idea. The ultimate idea is to produce nothing and sell it for a lot. Well, that's probably really difficult to do. All right, so now you don't have competition. And so now people buying the product are paying more. We call that monopoly profits, right, than they should be paying. And they're getting an inferior product. Microsoft knew that drill. Amazon knows that drill. Major companies, you're going to create buses. You got to get rid of the trolley cars. So you buy the trolley car company and you get rid of all of it. Now you have the buses. And now you politically go and you protect that. Right? You want to protect. You want to use the political structure to protect your wealth. Think about Google. They get an exemption from anyone really suing them. That's a major, major thing. That means they don't have to worry about the downside, but that means they control information, and they have no way of being controlled. And they move. I think it's 75% or 80% of the information market Google's got, which means they can give information to you, which is what you use to make decisions that they want you to have, good, bad, or indifferent. I don't care. I'm not looking to say that what Google does, the information they give you is good, bad, or indifferent. The fact is they control the information. That's a product. They're the one company making that have the largest market share, which means they can keep other people out, and which means they can control what you get, what you see. And one of the greatest ploys is we're going to give this here for nothing. Because once they can give it for nothing, they have the resources to do that. They'll drive everyone out of the marketplace. Nobody will come in and compete against the company, right? Where their costs are basically zero. Microsoft is a good example. Very poor operating system going on. They worked for IBM. IBM said we have this, small, clientele. These people that are really into computers. This goes way back, and we don't have an operating system for them. IBM was doing mainframes, and they had business. They had that market covered. This was sort of an annoyance. So they gave it to Microsoft, and they said, hey, go ahead, can you develop this thing? Microsoft said yes, because you don't say no to an opportunity. They went to someone else and said, hey, could you write this operating system? They wrote it. They didn't care about it because they were interested in the technology. Microsoft gets it, go to IBM. I'm flying over the history here. IBM says, okay, we'll get it out in the marketplace. IBM comes back and says, this is a really crappy operating system. There's all kinds of bugs. People are upset. Can you fix it? We can fix it. Go back to the guy and say, hey, you got to fix this. He says, I'm not interested in fixing it. This is a waste of my time. Okay, well, you sell it to us so we can fix it. Sure. Sells it for some ridiculously low price. Microsoft gets it, and they say, okay, let's tweak it. They tweak it, goes out in the marketplace. It's still buggy. Comes back. They try and fix it again. At some point, it's still buggy, and IBM says, we'll do this. But they refuse to sell them, their patent, their control over this system. Bill Gates realized this market's growing. It's not just this small group of people that love computers. It's starting to grow, and they see the potential of it. If they can control the micro market, right, then they can keep other people out. So what Microsoft did, fast forward, was they had to drive, they realized that it wasn't the operating system, which everyone had to have, which was money. You could make more also selling software. But they had to drive other people out of the software market in order to capture that market. By the way, with their operating system, what Microsoft realized is these guys are really into computers. They love to tinker with it. So they sent out these operating systems, beta testing them, and these guys that really knew it would come back and say, here's how you fix that bug. So for years and years, Microsoft was having other people for free as an intellectual exercise fix their product. So Microsoft decides, you know what? We can give people a word processing package and an Excel type package. Because people, balance their checkbook and they write letters. Okay, everybody does that. But there's WordPerfect, and there's Lotus, right? 1, 2, 3, created by a bunch of college professors who were into the intellectual side of it and didn't protect it. So how do you get that market? You give it to people for free. We're going to attach this because it doesn't cost anything. We're going to attach this to our operating system. We're going to give it to you for free. Just take it. You've got a spreadsheet application. Do your bills on it, and you've got a word processing package. They're giving it away for free. This drives really WordPerfect out of the marketplace, and also Lotus. And now everyone uses Excel and Word, which are not terribly different. Some of that stuff has been taken, right? Now they can control those markets. And what Microsoft realized is if you take your operating system and you give people software, and after a certain period of time, you make it so that software will no longer work with that operating system, people have to buy new computers, new operating systems, and new software. Planned obsolescence. This is how Microsoft makes its money. This is how they got so big. Amazon's doing the same thing. Railroads work the same way. Buses work the same way. You'd be amazed. This is the drill. This is how you do it. AT&T with its technology. AT&T used to, when it was the only player, it used to subsidize individual use, home use of phones by charging corporations more. Judge Green, going way back, broke all that up. AT&T split into all these other companies, and of course they worked very hard to come back together and grab as much of the market again as they could. This is the normal process for them. This is what capitalism does. And so now we have these different, Verizon and all these other companies. What's interesting is that they've gotten the government to give them for a while rights, because they have to put up towers, to a certain area. No other company, right, can go in and put a tower there. So if you want great reception in that area, you may have to go with AT&T or Verizon, because they control that area through their towers. Again, it's about capturing the market. So when we talk about macroeconomics, what we're really talking about is, this move forward. And that changes the culture and the way we socialize the things. We just accept them, that this is the way it works, to the great detriment of many people. So if you look at how it's been done over time, that's the typical way it gets done. Drive everyone out of the market, capture the market, inferior product, greater price, lower cost to produce, incredible wealth. Everyone talks about that top 10% or 5% of wage earners, or people, capture wealth. We're really talking about 1%, and probably 1% of that 1% that control an awful lot. I mean, think about how much Bezos controls now. I mean, everybody. And they keep coming up with more ideas. You can't compete against them. Others try. They don't succeed. They're a monopoly. Monopolies are bad in a capitalist system. They're the death of a capitalist system. It makes it impossible for those gates of fate to really budge, or for someone to somehow catapult themselves over that dangerous river into the elite class. In the Constitution of the United States, it's one of the things that are there to limit the likelihood of monopolies. Unfortunately, the execution of that resides in the Department of Justice, and they don't have the resources to really go after those that have monopolized an industry. Antitrust. Now think about the word trust. Anti means not. There's no trust there. And what is that trust about? It's about the marketplace. And so typically the drill there is that you'll have major companies come to the Department of Justice and say, look, you want to come after us. For every attorney you put on this, we're going to put 30. we're going to bury you in the court system, and you're not going to succeed. But I'll tell you what. This is not always the case, but this is pretty much the drill. What we're going to do is we're going to give you $200 million. Make this go away. You can tell the public, hey, they paid a penalty, $200 million, and for most people, they'll think, wow, they really slammed this company. If you look at BP, what they did in the Gulf, to quiet everybody, they just went in and said, look, we'll just give you this money and we'll clean it up. And the politicians said, see what we've done? We're going to clean it up. And they had to pay a heavy price. Most people, the company pays $1 billion. It's like, wow. But not if they're making $50 billion. Wouldn't you give $1 to be able to keep 50? Right? This is the landscape under which we Homo sapiens now operate. We have come to be culturally and politically socialized in America to accept this. And we've watched wealth move further and further to the top, which has alienated more and more of the mass public. Whether we like the way that they've reacted or not to it, it has alienated them. And people are looking for a change. And so naturally, it would go to those systems that they know, systems that are happening elsewhere. They tend to look at those systems and say, this would work here. But the culture here is different. The path forward has been different. That's why it's so hard to compete with China. China's culture is dictatorial. We lead, and their politics, their culture is structured that way, and their politics support that. But they figured it out. Well, we're not a capitalist democratic society, but if we keep our social structure, our culture, we can get people to work for very little, and we can draw a lot of wealth to us. They're beating America at its own game. Capitalism, not with democracy, capitalism with a dictatorial structure. And that is better. Now, I'm not saying it's better culturally or politically for people. Chinese people, what it is a system you can't beat. Democracy allows for individuals to capture the wealth. That system allows the elites there to capture the wealth in a way that America can't, because they can control everything. When you control everything, it's easy to beat a competitive system where they're trying to capture markets. Then all you got to do is invite those people in. Want to make more money? We got cheap labor here. And those companies would not go into China unless China's promised to affect the rule of law. We don't want you taking our companies from us. So you got to promise there's a structure here. But China is able to do certain things in terms of getting intellectual property and the like. You come up with an idea, you get a patent on it. Major company comes in and steals your patent. Good luck going to the court system trying to fight them and their 30 lawyers. So you had a great idea, you came up with it, you figured it out, market share, they won't buy it, they'll just take, not only China, but American companies, they'll just take your patent. How do you fight that? So a lot of power vested in that corporate class, in the political class, and the like, means less opportunity. And all those wants we wanted fade away. And we struggle for our needs. And then if they can pit us against each other based on some demographic, that's better for them. Because then we're not thinking about class structure and how that's been manipulated. We're thinking about the other. It's like we're back to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. And I don't mean that judging anyone. I'm just saying that we're back to those two groups. We've been separated. These control all the resources, and these folks want some resources or they want needs met. And that's not what's happening. Consequently, what you have is you have conflict. You have conflict. Now, there's some great books, on this idea currently of what's going on. And I won't get into those, but they really exemplify how this system works and what kinds of problems it engenders. And for a free society, Franklin had it right when asked after the convention, what kind of government do we have? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. He understood that there's a built-in structure has a built-in opportunity for people to garner the wealth and capture it. And that's been human history from the very first moment. It starts off, as I started at the beginning, with this evolutionary movement, and here we are today, with more and more wealth going to fewer and fewer people, and people having less and less opportunity, but still buying the old American adage about in America anyone can make it. And they then point to the anomalies, those that have, and say, see, they made it. Meanwhile, the playing field is not level. It's becoming less and less so, I believe. And that makes it harder and harder. And so it's no wonder that there's great despair and civil unrest, which seems to be growing at this point in time. People recognize it, but they're not focusing on class. They're focusing on race and other demographic sort of things that define us. And I think that's a mistake. I think yes, there's conflict and there's differences between people, and the culture sort of is rattling, and the political structure is becoming very, very separate. The media is also doing that because they need market share. So the capitalist nature of the media system is also problematic. So a lot of our institutions are rattling, and they're getting clunky. And we're in this transformational period where it looks very unsettling. And that tends to unsettle all areas. It sort of echoes through, the entire structure. The culture is changing very quickly, it seems, and that's never a good thing. Transitions in culture that happen quickly are very destabilizing. You don't change your culture overnight. Political institutions trying to keep up with that so they can keep their power further distort that process. So socialization into these two very important, structures, culture and political, are the things that we need to fix. We need to work on those things. Pretty hard to do in the environment we have today. This major competition between elites to garner as much power as possible and keep it from others. That's always been the case, but this is really intense. And it's got a lot of people concerned. So what I would argue at this point is that you have to look at all these various elements, revolutions that have happened, the Homo sapien sort of mindset, wants and needs, those differences, the economic structure and the democratic structure, how they work together, what they are, what kinds of problems that all of these create for socializing people into a culture and into a political structure. Now, last thing, is doing that bad? Does it make it harder for people to integrate globally? Is globalization a good thing or a bad thing? You get scholars on both sides arguing it out, and that's not our job here, again, but nevertheless, it's an issue. Globalization, does it serve more people, or does it just help the elites garner more wealth? Is it destabilizing to those cultures in those geographic areas, or not? Because from day one, it's all been about two words: stability and survival. Stability and survival. You can't survive in an unstable environment. Very hard, right? So survival then becomes a major challenge. And that's not why we all joined up. We didn't sign up to have things get more difficult for us. We signed up because this would help us get our needs and then eventually give us a better circumstance for getting our wants. That's the end of the lecture.